Good day everyone. Welcome to Basic Research class. This is the part 2 of the research problem and objectives. In general, research objectives describe what we expect to achieve by the project. In this topic, we will talk about the research objectives, the theoretical and conceptual framework. The intended learning outcomes of these lessons are the following. We will try to define the importance of research objectives. We will learn and know the types of research objectives. We will define and differentiate theoretical and conceptual framework. Research objectives are usually expressed in lay terms and are directed as much to the client as the researcher. Research objectives may be linked with a hypothesis or used as a statement of purpose in a study that does not have a hypothesis. So, we will try to determine the direction of your study. Research objectives because research objectives define the focus and indicate the steps involved. It includes every specific problems to be addressed and indicate the variables involved. And so, research objectives should be closely related to the statement of the problem and summarize what you hope will be achieved by the study. For example, if the problem identified is low utilization of antenatal care services, so the general objective of the study could be to identify the reasons for this low uptake in order to find ways of improving it. So writing your research objectives clearly helps to, first, define the focus of your study. Okay. Clearly identify variables to be measured, if it is quantitative. Indicate the various types to be involved. Establish the limits of the study. Avoid collection of any data that is not strictly necessary. So, what are the importance of objectives? Research is an organized investigation of a problem where an investigator attempts to gain solutions to a particular problem. In order to get the right solution, a clearly defined objectives are very important. A clearly defined objective directs a researcher in the right direction. And a clearly defined objectives are important feature of a good research study. Without a clear objective, the researcher is aimless, directionless in conducting the study. Without focused objectives, no replicable scientific findings can be expected. Right? So, what's the meaning of research objectives? A research objective is a clear, concise, declarative statement which provides direction to investigate the variables under the study, of course. The research objectives focus on the ways to measure the variables, such as to identify or describe what the research is trying to achieve. The objectives of the research project summarize what is to be studied. Okay. Research is a concrete statement describing what the research is trying to achieve. So, a well-known objective should be SMART, or S for specific, M for measurable, A for attainable, R realistic, and T is time-bounded. Take note that research objectives should be relevant, feasible, logical, observable, unequivocal, or measurable. Objective is a purpose that can be reasonably achieved within the expected time frame and with the available resources. The objective of research projects summarizes what is to be achieved by the study. The research objectives are the specific accomplishments the researcher hopes to achieve by the study. The objectives includes obtaining answers to research questions or testing the research hypothesis. So, the need for objectives are the following. The formulation of research objectives will help the researcher as follows. First, focus. A clearly defined research objectives will help the researcher to focus on the study. The formulation of research objectives help the narrowing down the study to its essentials, and it will avoid unnecessary findings which otherwise lead to wastage of resources. So avoid unnecessary data, for example. The formulation of research objectives helps the researcher to avoid unnecessary accumulation of data that is not needed for the chosen problem. For example, when the researcher is interested in identifying the presence of absence or absenteeisms of choosing variables, rather absence of choosing variables but not in detailed description, he can avoid collection of unwanted information. So, for organization, the formulation of the objectives organizes the study into a clearly defined parts or phases. Thus, the objectives help organize the study results into main parts as per the preset objectives. Okay, it gives directions, meaning a well-formulated objective will facilitate the development of research methodology and will help to orient the collection, analysis, interpretation, and utilization of data. So, what are the types of objectives? We have the general objectives. General objectives are broad goals to be achieved. The general objectives of the study states what the researcher expects to achieve by the study in general terms. The general objectives is met through meeting the specific objectives stated, while specific objectives means these are short terms and narrow in focus, while general objectives are broken into smaller or small logical connected parts to form specific objectives. And the specific objectives clearly specify what the researcher will do in the study, where and for what purpose the study is done. For example, a quasi-experimental study on the effect of poverty on education among selected cities in India. So, what are now the specific objectives? Specifically, this study seeks to first assess the effect of poverty on education among and so on and so forth. Second, determine the prevalence of poverty among and so on and so forth. Compare the severity of morning sickness among etc. Identify the relationship of poverty with age or other selected demographic variables. So, what's the method of stating objectives? The following guidelines must be taken into account while stating the objectives. First, the objective should be presented briefly and concisely. The objective should cover the different aspects of the problem and its contributing factors in a coherent way and in logical sequence. The objectives should be clearly phrased in operational terms, specifying exactly what the researcher is going to do, where and for what purpose. The objectives are realistic considering the local conditions, and the objectives use action verbs that are specific to be evaluated. For example, for knowledge domain, you can use count, define, describe, draw, identify, label, list, match, and so on and so forth. For application domain, add, apply, calculate, change, complete, compute, demonstrate, discover, examine, graph, interpolate, and so on and so forth. For comprehension, you can use the term associate, compute, convert, defend, discuss, distinguish, estimate, or explain, or extend, and so on and so forth. For analysis domain, you can use analyze, arrange, break down, combine, design, detect, develop, diagram, differentiate, discriminate, and so on and so forth. For synthesis, you can use the term categorize, combine, compile, compose, create, drive, design, devise, etc. For evaluation domain, you can use the term appraise, assess, compare, conclude, contrast, right? Criticize or critique, determine, grade, interpret, judge, and so on and so forth. So, let's talk about the theoretical and conceptual framework. When are you going to use theoretical? When are you going to use conceptual framework? When not to use conceptual framework, especially. Okay, you use theoretical framework and conceptual framework if you're doing quantitative research. But if you're doing qualitative research, you are not going to use conceptual framework, but rather stick on theoretical framework. Now, what's the reason? As we all know, conceptual framework it's actually a graphical representation of the variables you wanted to describe, you want to test, you want to look into the relationships. But in qualitative research, there is no variable that you want to test. There's no variable that you're going to look the relationships. In other words, it is not necessary, right, to have a conceptual framework, but rather a conceptual analysis will do. What does a conceptual analysis has? All right, you go back to the theoretical framework and try to look into how the theories work together for you to be able to achieve your goal, right? Your objective, your purpose of the study. Okay, for you to be able to answer the gaps that you have mentioned in your introduction. Okay, let's try to define first. What is a framework? A framework described as the abstract or logical structure of meaning that guides the development of the study. All frameworks are based on the identification of key concepts and the relationships among those concepts. While concepts abstractly describes and names an object or phenomenon, thus providing it with a separate identity and meaning. Okay? An intellectual representation of some aspects of reality that is derived from observations made from phenomena. So, if you are asked, how do you construct conceptual framework? When to use IPO or input process output? You use IPO if your design is a developmental design. But if it is not, then it is not. Okay, do not use IPO in the conceptual framework, right? But rather, okay, try to look into the variables you want to test. Okay, you want to describe, or you want to look the relationships, right? So that's the time that you're going to use conceptual framework. But if it is a qualitative framework, then there is no need for you to use the conceptual framework. Why? Again, there's no variable that you are going to describe or to look into the relationships, right? But rather, in qualitative research, what we're doing in qualitative research basically is you are putting all the complex experiences of an individual into one picture. Okay, because you are looking into the multiple realities of different experiences, okay, and putting it in one picture, and this is how you look into the phenomenon. Okay, you will understand that if we go deeper and discuss about the different designs for qualitative research. Same thing for quantitative research and for mixed methods. Now, if you're going to ask me, how about some mixed methods? Is it necessary to have both theoretical framework and conceptual framework? Of course, right? Especially conceptual framework, because that is where we're going to look into when the qualitative aspects of your study comes in, for you to be able to either to explain the variable, the result, or the variable support the qualitative research. Now, it depends upon the designs that you use if you're doing mixed methods. So, theoretical framework and conceptual framework should be present in mixed method designs. Alright, let's proceed. For constructs, meaning it's a concept at a very high level of abstraction that have general meanings. For example, a construct associated with the concept of anxiety. Variables. These signify a more concrete level and are narrow in their definitions. A variable is more specific and is measurable. Take note that framework can be derived from related concepts or conceptual, or existing theories or theoretical. The terms conceptual framework and theoretical framework are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are different meanings. Okay? So when we talk about conceptual framework, it's your concept, how you're going to describe the variables or test the variables. But if we talk about theoretical framework, you're talking about the theories that you wanted to prove. Okay? You wanted to look into if it's really true or not. Okay? Because at the end of the day, after you conduct your study, you go back to your theory if it is acceptable or not. And if not, then how are you to refute that? You have to explain it based on your study. Alright? You reflect. You go back again to the drawing board and try to look into what happened to your data. Why is it that this is the result? And despite that you follow the procedures, okay, that is basically aligned with how other researchers have conducted using the same theories. Okay, that's the essence of doing of supporting your literature, your theory with a literature review, right? Because it is also where you are going to look what variables that this particular study have conducted using this theory. Now you go to your study. Okay, what's the role now of that variable in your study? And then you inject a new variable so that you will have a new insight as your contribution to the body of knowledge. Okay? Right. So let's talk about understanding conceptual and theoretical framework. About conceptual framework. Okay, this consists of concepts that are placed within the logical and sequential design, represents less formal structure, and used to studies in which existing theory is inapplicable or insufficient, based on specific concepts and propositions derived from empirical observations and intuitions. So may reduce theories, or rather deduce theories from a conceptual framework. So what is now the purpose? Meaning to clarify concepts and propose relationships among the concepts or in a study, to provide a context for interpreting the study findings, to explain observations, to encourage theory development that is useful for practice. Okay, theoretical framework. The theory provides a point of focus for attacking the unknown in a specific area. If a relationship is found between two or more variables, a theory should be formulated to explain why the relationships exist. Theories are purposely created and formulated, never discovered. They can be tested but never proven. According to Attila, defined theory as an explanation of a phenomenon or an abstract generalization that systematically explain the relationships among given phenomena for purposes of explaining, predicting, and controlling such phenomena. So the theoretical framework consists of theories that seem to be interrelated. The explanation concerns the relationship between two or more variables or phenomena, more formal and used for studies based on existing theories, derived from specific concepts and propositions, and that are induced or deduced. So the importance of theory in research, the function of theory in research is that it identify the starting point of the research problem and to establish the vision to which the problem is actually directed. It determines and defines the focus and goal of the research problem. Conceptualization, in terms of key terms. This process of forming basic ideas, designs, plans, or strategies based on given facts. Propositions, a statement or assertion for the relationships between concepts derived from theories or generalization based on empirical data. So what are the purposes of theoretical framework? Maybe we wanted to test these theories, as I said a while ago. Make research findings meaningful and generalizable because theories explain this, right? And then establish orderly connections between observations and facts. Remember that you have conducted the literature review in relation to that particular theories. So you wanted now to establish an orderly connection between observations and facts. Now, to predict and control situations. And finally, stimulate your research. Okay? So assumptions and guidelines in the use of basic assumptions in planning or creating a research. What are the things you consider in mind? So think of it. So what do you want? What do you assume? Okay? In this stage. Okay, so we will talk about this in the next meeting. Okay, thank you very much. These are the references. Thank you so much.